I'm going to talk slowly while we get the computer set up. She has applied the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties to dozens of historic landscapes throughout the U.S., including iconic places such as Yosemite National Park, Mendocino Woodlands, Doris Ranch in Oregon, San Francisco Civic Center Historic District, and Hearst Castle. Her practice includes development of master plans, cultural landscape reports, and cultural landscape inventories that preserve historic character and enhance the contemporary functionality and sustainability of historic properties. She is the president-elect of Oregon's SLA, Go Ducks. Laurie holds a BFA from Lewis and Clark College and a BLA and MLA from the University of Oregon. Thank you, welcome.
Thank you very much. We're still getting things set up, so and I just have not used a mouse or a thing like this. I just need a little bit of, okay. And is there a pointer? Okay, great. Switch. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm excited to be here. I'm going to take us away from code for a little while and talk a little bit about how a lot of the things that you guys have been learning and discussing today are actually applied in the landscape. Let me see if I can get, there we go. And then can people online see the pointer as well? No, they cannot. Kind of, sort of. Just curious. Okay, I'll just get around it. So some of the goals that we typically take into our projects, and I'm really talking mostly about how we're applying this in the landscape, which is because that's my specialty, is that we are first and foremost trying to preserve and restore landscape historic character. And sometimes applying these guidelines and codes actually allows us to do that. We're embracing universal design principles. We're enhancing visitor experience and access. And we are meeting appropriate ADA or ABA, which is primarily what I work in because I'm working in mainly federal properties, the code. And a lot of times we're trying to seek synergies where those two things come together. People are coming to these places to experience something really unique, and we want to make sure that they have the ability to access those places, but that it remains that kind of unique place that they are coming to see. We want to kind of push and pull the codes and the guidelines, both from the Secretary of the Interior standards and ABA or ADA, and kind of see where those kind of things can come together and really benefit each other. So I'm going to talk about 3 case studies in particular, all here in California, all in national parks. The first one is going to be Curry Village in Yosemite National Park. And how many people in the audience here with me have been there? I would expect as much. Have you stayed in Curry Village? Fabulous. So this may look slightly different because this is actually a before image. A lot of these cabins have been rehabilitated. But a lot of the character here is you want to stay in a woodland. You want to be immersed in that experience, but you also want the comforts of a nice, lovely cabin. So that's kind of where we're going from here. And one of the things that I want to point out is, along this edge, it'll come back to us later when I talk about things, is that the path is edged by some stones on the left-hand side. So the project area, as you can see here, were these hard-sided cabins. It was necessitated by a rock fall that occurred in 2008, which took a lot of the hard-sided cabins out of commission. And so upgrading and rehabilitating these cabins was really important to the National Park Service, Yosemite National Park in particular. And so the goals were really to try to provide access to these unique environments. And there were 2 actually types of environments that we were looking at. So this was one collection of historic cabins. And these were very similar to the ones that I just showed in the image. And there's a very unique cabin here called Stoneman Cabin, which was another very unique experience. We wanted to provide access to both. And I won't get into some of the techniques that the architects use. I'm really going to focus a little bit more on the landscape. But just to orient you is that there's a parking lot right here. Stoneman Meadow is up to the north. This is the talus slope, kind of the edge of the rock cliff that Glacier Point is on the top of. And there are a series of trails through here that link the various cabins. One of the other things that was really critical here is that interrelationship between the cabins and the trees, so you really do feel immersed in the experience. So I'll talk a little, that'll come into play in terms of some of the solutions that we used. So here's a before shot of two of the cabins that were in that kind of that main complex of historic cabins. And oops. This is some of the issues that we were seeing here were that these weren't very seamless. That there was kind of this pretty big drop off right here between the edge of the patio and the landscape below. It was pretty unclear in the asphalt parking lot where the striping was and kind of where the actual parking space was. The other thing that you can't really tell from this image is that the pathway here was shorter for one cabin and longer for the other. So it was an unequal experience based on where the parking locations were. This is an after shot. This is, so the relationship, although it's incredibly subtle, between the landscape and the building, which was really critical, kind of a character defining feature of this area, was maintained. And so you could actually feel like it was a more part of the landscape as opposed to kind of elevated and off, and that there wasn't this kind of tripping hazard. One of the other things that we did was that the signs, when they didn't have to meet ABA code, we tried to keep them as rustic as possible, but still really clear and simple so that people knew where they were and where the cabins were. And instead of doing asphalt, we went to concrete. We could have, in terms of materiality in this area, we could have continued with asphalt with the code, but we had seen what had happened with the constant snow removal during the winters, that the spaces were less defined. They didn't kind of stand up to kind of winter wear and maintenance in the park. And so this made it more clear. Plus the pathway is kind of equal distance between the two different cabins. It provides a really equal experience to both. So it's a fairly simple solution, pretty basic. Then it was really the next kind of set of design solutions that we got a little bit more complicated for us. This is kind of an interior shot of the exterior of Stoneman Cabin, that kind of unique cabin that is within this area, and you can see why this place is coveted. It's got a beautiful fireplace. It has like a separate bedroom. It's really kind of one of the unique cabins in that area. But so we wanted people of all abilities to be able to experience this and have it really be an easy case. This is still under construction. So this is actually, I believe, being constructed now because the whole project was done in phases. Just to kind of reorient again, this is Stoneman Cabin right here. The parking lot is up to the north. There's a series of paths which you can see on the right-hand side. This is kind of the character of these existing paths. One is really kind of road width, and this is the main path that most people use to access the various cabins through here. And then there are these kind of secondary paths, which are in the lower right-hand corner, which are a little bit more narrow, typically lined with either wood or stone, and that's what kind of goes through here. So it was those paths, in terms of looking kind of at the various areas, that we started to explore a variety of solutions. So this is the main path through. Oops. Sorry about that. That's counterintuitive to me. There we go. So most people, the solution that the Park Service was looking at was going around here. That was on a path like this. The issue with that was that it was a much longer route than we wanted to, that we thought was kind of above and beyond. It's also very wide. So either you have to pave this from side to side to provide kind of the same kind of character and width of that path, because that was actually a defining characteristic of that pathway, its width and kind of how it was kind of a primary path in comparison to some of the secondary paths. Or you would have a path that was paved and more narrow, but then you kind of take away some of the character of that woodland setting. And you do it in a way that this is used by trucks and cars and people, and it would have maybe caused a little bit more of an issue there. And then you have these kind of secondary paths, which is where we started to look in terms of solutions. So this was an early iteration of that moving. So at one point, all of the accessible parking spaces were in one area, but we split them up and put the two here to accommodate these two cabins, and then put one here to accommodate this. Utilized a path the Park Service was actually going to take out It wasn't being utilized as much as some of the other secondary paths. So we really saw a great link up to here. We initially had it go along here, kind of along the edge of this other Stoneman house, because there was kind of an access point. It kind of would go along the edge and not affect any of the trees and the woodlands, especially the oaks, which are really prized and very sensitive here. But we found out when we talked to operations and maintenance that that's basically where all the snow and ice builds up. So you were going to create an accessible pathway in an area that was going to be constantly frozen and icy and pretty dangerous in the winter. So we kind of backed off that, and we went back and looked at another place here. There was this little woodland right here. We initially had been told that this was an area of really heightened sensitivity. When we went back to the variety kind of cultural natural resource folks, they said that no, it would actually work. And so we brought the path through here, providing that kind of woodland experience. You're immediately immersed into the woodland, and then a really short, nice, quick, efficient way to get into the Stoneman house. It's also like their personal pathway. So it was interesting that this path that was the most kind of direct path of travel was also providing the best possible experience for people who were, ready to be in the outdoors and kind of experience that sense of place. And this is just a detail shot where we did, as I mentioned, the paths there are lined with either the wood or the stone. We chose the stone because of its durability. And because the concrete pathway could be tied into the landscape a little bit better. So the devil's in the details, but that's one of those things that we kind of went back and forth on. Because even though most of the paths in that area had the kind of wood border, this was a better surface and better edging surface for the particular material that we were using. So the second example is pretty simple, and that's one of the things I wanted to kind of mention is sometimes, when we look at all these codes and we're dealing with the Secretary of the Interior standards and we're dealing with ADA or ABA code, it's really easy to get caught up in a lot of the detail and the no's and can'ts and the, kind of how all these things kind of come together. So we typically step back and just try to think about what's the simplest solution. And a lot of times that's actually where the symbiotic kind of quality of these two things comes together. So this is Grant Grove and Sequoia Kings Canyon. Again, how many people in the room, has anybody been to this particular area? Good. It's a little kind of one of the few, in addition to Curry Village, these hard-sided tent cabin areas. There's a few left in the park. Here's another image kind of showing where those cabins are in kind of the landscape. So you can see that the cabins are kind of in kind of a little cluster. They are surrounded by some woodlands, not as thick as the ones in Curry Village. And there's some drainage issues here, which cause some issues in terms of the paths remaining level and clear of debris. There's some erosion on the right-hand side of that image that comes off the hill that has caused some issues with that kind of dicey access area. I don't know if you can see that, but this is actually, people have kind of, you hear about paths that people kind of create by themselves. This is kind of what people have kind of created this driveway for themselves. So we kind of looked at that in terms of solutions. So I know this is a lot of architecture drawing stuff. But here's the cabins that we were looking at. We were also putting in a bathhouse. So instead of, the simple solution here was that instead of having people come up these stairs into the cabins, we actually, on the downhill side, we switched it and had them come in on the uphill side. Oops. Which is right here. So typically, as you can see with these, the pathway is on the downhill side, the slope is coming down this way, and they enter through a set of stairs that goes into the cabin. We didn't change it on all of them because that was considered a character-defining feature of these cabins, but we did switch it for the ones that we wanted to make accessible. So we just switched the path to the uphill side, and then you have a really clear ramp into the building. It maintained the spatial organization, it maintained their position and location, because one of the other solutions or kind of options that we were looking at was moving them all to one area, right? Kind of that this was flatter and moving them all down to one area. that takes them out of kind of that community feeling of cabins. It also takes them away from kind of the experience of being up on that hillside and having some views out from there. We were trying to prevent that from happening. Here's just some of the solutions that kind of from an architectural standpoint, kind of where the ramp and where the stairs came together. So the final project is actually going through construction documents right now. And as you can see, this is not a particularly accessible landscape. Just going to point you out to this left-hand image. This is the Point Reyes Lighthouse. How many people have been here? This is a very popular place, yeah. So I'm glad you guys have been to most of these places because I think it'll help explain kind of what the challenges were. But these are people in this lower right-hand corner of the left-hand image, and they are trying to, in these early days, build, I'm not going to call it accessible, but at least a path that is linking them to the lighthouse. They're blasting rock, they're trying to create level spaces. And as you know, if you've been there, it's kind of level on the top side, which I'll show here. So this whole path that goes along the spine of the ridge is relatively flat until you get about 2/3 of the way over, and then it's an incredibly steep staircase down to the lighthouse, and I'll show you some images here in a second. So this is the path that kind of goes along the ridge, and it's relatively flat. There are some kind of areas where you go up and down. There are some kind of grade changes that are clearly a challenge, but compared to this, it really is flat as can be. It's also incredibly steep on both sides. There are sheer cliffs kind of on both edges. So this is really kind of the path of travel that they've used historically and that we were trying to restore in the future. Just to give a sense, a little bit of kind of the character of some of the materials and some of the paths that were there historically. On the left-hand side, that is a road. That is where they were bringing mainly horses early on and then some cars. They also had a series of boardwalks that went through the central area of the property. And then this is an image of the stairs. This is actually looking up. You can see there's a building right here, a fence along the right-hand side. There's a series of steps, and on the left, if you can see this gentleman, he's actually sitting in kind of a little, like a coal chute. And they would use that to bring supplies down to the lighthouse and back up. Some other images of the site. On the left-hand side, you can see the path of travel that runs through, kind of the path that runs through the center of the property by what was houses where the people who were managing the lighthouse were living. They were also living up here. This is a little bit later. This is in the 1960s after they made some changes to the property. And now the path of travel, there is still a path here, but this is now kind of private. So any public access comes up this kind of steep, more narrow road, goes by this garage, kind of goes back of house, and then kind of comes back down here. So right now, they've removed people from experiencing that path that people have used historically. So we started to look through a variety of solutions. Sometimes we put solutions forward just to ask and answer the question, just to kind of rule them out, and to provide the ability to write, talk a little bit about what Dawn was saying, kind of document that you've looked through all the different solutions. So this is the kind of that central area where there's the employee housing in the middle. This is an overlook. This is the stairs going down to Lighthouse. Our facilities in terms of this project are the restrooms, which are in this garage, the overlook here, and the visitor center. There are plans to make it accessible down to the lighthouse, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second, but I'm going to focus just on the facilities that were part of our scope of work. So currently, the accessible parking is over on the right-hand side at the end of that little red line, and people walk along walk along the road and then come up through here and then and it's not accessible. They can also drive up to that garage if they get special permission, but as you can see, that road is incredibly narrow, so there's a lot of conflicts between pedestrians and vehicles. Park Service vehicles are doing maintenance there. It's just there's a pretty big pinch point there. We also looked at bringing the accessible parking much closer to the employee housing. And then removing the path of travel up to the garage where the restrooms are and reinforcing the historic path of travel through to the visitor center and the overlook. And then having it go back, it's a much more kind of gentle grade back up this way. And we have more leeway in terms of the landscape, in terms of the topography. It's not as pinched, it's not as steep on the downhill side. And third, we kind of looked at providing all those options. Bringing the accessible parking closer to the facility and restoring the historic path of travel, but also providing access from both ways. One of the issues with this is that in order to do the kind of the more direct route from the accessible parking space to the garage, you would have to, there's a sensitive resources on the uphill side, so you'd have to build out and do a boardwalk if you wanted to try to separate it. And it just, even then, the grade is preventative. It doesn't give an easier kind of experience. It still would be a challenge for some to make it up that little hill. And there's not the length. We don't have the ability, a lot of times we can try to extend the path itself and try to build it up on one side or the other. And this just doesn't have, you're hemmed in by the topography, you're hemmed in by those natural resources and natural kind of topography that are just really kind of pretty harsh up here. And this is the experience that we're trying to get. We were trying to draw people out so they would have an experience of walking through here. This is between where the current accessible parking space is and the employee housing. And then here, restoring kind of this path of travel as opposed to, and here you can see what I'm talking about in terms of how that's hemmed in. We would have to remove this fence, which actually we thought initially was historic. It is not. That actually proved to be not an issue. But there was a fence there historically, it just wasn't this one. We would have had to build a boardwalk out here, and even then, this is an incredibly steep hillside here. So the engineering and some of the impacts to the landscape, both natural and cultural, we're starting to prove insurmountable there. This is another issue or kind of image of the stairs, and you can see how hard it is to get accessible. So one of the things that we're looking at here is we actually did look at potentially putting in, because this stair has been rebuilt, so the alignment itself is historic, but the actual staircase, the actual physical staircase is not. And so we are looking at options to put kind of a chute on the side and have people be able to get down to the lighthouse and back up. It would also, we're always trying to look at those kind of dual purposes. It would help first responders. If people get into a medical distress at the lighthouse, it's incredibly hard to get people back up to the top at this point. So that's another solution. It's not part of the project that we're doing now, but it is something that we've started to look at into the future. So where we landed after a lot of debate, because we're really trying to weigh people who are coming here. They want that experience. They want to be outdoors. They want to feel the elements. We want them to experience the full range of this place. So we kind of went back and forth on a lot of those topics. We put the employee parking where the current accessible parking slot is. We moved the accessible parking closer to the kind of the visitor or the employee area. Restored the path of travel, even though it's a private residence now, there is the possibility that that will be the site of a future visitor center. And so at this point, we're just going to provide some kind of barriers there so that there's a little bit of a screen between public and private at this point. And we will improve the pathway, back this way up to the garage, provide that accessible path of travel up to the restroom. We talked a little bit about that, if the experience of driving through here would hopefully give people the same kind of equal access to that experience of driving through the cypress. And because we're asking them to go slow, they'll be able to see the views, which are incredible from that particular portion of the road. It also allowed us to potentially save some of those Monterey cypress, which are considered historic, not indigenous, but historic. And because any kind of work that we did on the road, in order to make it meet code, would have been on that kind of north side of the road, and it would have potentially hurt the roots of the trees. And then you can see here some of the issues that we had to deal with. I mean, even though I said it's fairly flat, there were a couple pinch points towards the overlook and the visitor center, and so kind of bringing the grade up towards the overlook so that it wasn't such a steep incline from the path up to the overlook was going to be mitigated. And then how that kind of rippled back, because we had to raise it there, and how that kind of went back towards the visitor center was kind of an issue because we needed to meet where that threshold was there. And there was another series of steps that go back down to this pump house, meeting that as well. And so trying to kind of pull those back together. One of the other synergies that we looked at was we had to have a landing kind of in between the employee housing and the visitor center. And so fortunately, it worked almost to the T in terms of the length between when the slope started, so that the point of where we had to put kind of a resting area was also a perfect viewing point for a particular kind of a really great grand view of the ocean and some of the some special kind of plant material there. So looking for those synergies to bring the code and make it work for us in terms of interpretation and visitor experience in particular. And so that is the end. Those are the three kind of most recent experiences and kind of examples of applying the code into the landscape of historic properties. Questions?
Right, Laurie, thanks. Great presentation. Going back to Yosemite Park.
Sure.
Who has the obligation for an ongoing obligation for accessibility, the federal government or the park operator?
The federal government does. They own the property. Do you mean in terms of the relationship between the National Park Service and the concessionaire?
Yeah.
Yeah, the National Park Service does. And they are typically our kind of last word in terms of the client, though we are typically working with both in terms of the project.
And then does federal government have any comment on access to Half Dome?
Say that again.
Climbing Half Dome. Is there any?
I haven't heard any conversations about that.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm working on another project in Curry Village right now.
Yeah.
That is also dealing with accessibility, and I will ask that question because I'm curious. No, I haven't heard anything.
Someone says, I want the experience of Half Dome, but I can't climb up there. I'm going to sue the federal government. I mean, yeah. I don't know. That's a possibility?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's not a historic property, so it's a little bit outside my realm of experience because I'm primarily working with historic properties, but I'm sure, yeah. But that area is not designated as a historic district. So it doesn't have that designation. Not that it's not eligible, it just doesn't have it.
We have another question over here.
Hi. How do you, when you get into, you go beyond the hardscape of your project, because it sounds like a lot of what you were talking about today had to do with accessibility and hardscape. I mean, what do you do in terms of getting into specifying actual plant material? Because 3 of us here today are from Palo Alto, and we have guidelines and things that tell us historically how to treat certain neighborhoods and districts. And it talks about the landscape and the plant material, and it's kind of, I guess, it's hard to really understand, how can this tree that you put in be more historic than this tree? So I thought it would be really interesting to hear your response about plant material and how that can lend itself to the historic environment.
Absolutely. I didn't really talk about that much today because I was focusing on accessibility, but we start with the research and we start with the resources that are there themselves. So as I mentioned with Curry Village, the trees there are the primary vegetation that we were trying to preserve, in particular the oaks, because they are being shaded out by some of the other conifers there. And just because of the nature of the valley not being burnt, they're disappearing. So it really is a case-by-case basis in terms of what plant material is historic. We typically do research in terms of what was there during the historic period and base our determination on what you save and what is up for grabs based on that research. So in Palo Alto, you probably have a lot of mid-century modern landscapes. And so to use that as an example, because it's so different from what I just talked about, you would try to look and see what was designed or what was planted by the architect or landscape architect and prioritize those over ones that had been added since the end of the historic period. if you don't have a planting plan or planting details, there's a lot of information about what styles of plants, what types of plants are used at various eras. And that would also be a really good starting point in terms of kind of focusing your plant palette. And then we typically do take that through another level of filters. Are any of those plants causing problems from an invasive species perspective? And if that's the case, then we try to look for things that have a similar character and feel of the historic plant and substitute it with something that has that same character. So we are, landscapes change. They're a little bit different than buildings. I mean, buildings change too, don't get me wrong, but landscapes by their nature change. And so there is a little bit more leeway in terms of what your rehabilitation guidelines and what your recommendations can be in terms of things like plant material, because they are changing every day. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm happy to answer more specifics. It is, but like I said, it's really grounded in the research. It really has to be grounded in a pretty good, extensive knowledge of what the property's character was. And that's for all landscape features. It's not just plant material. It's circulation features, pathways, it's any kind of outdoor, small scale features, signs if it's a public property. All of those things need to be based on an understanding of what the place, the property looked like during the historic period. Sure, you're welcome.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much,
Great,
Laurie.
thank you very much.